let's start with the Weimar Republic, because the Weimar Republic was the core of most of European diplomacy in the first half of the interwar period. And we've got some key dates to remember. Who knows when the Little Entente was formed? Little interest in being interactive, so I'll just give you all the dates. In 1921, the Little Entente is formed. Basically, the Czechs, the Romanians, and the Yugoslavians agreed to an alliance already, in spite of what's it called? In spite of this League of Nations vision of collective security. And the French are basically supporting them because the French see them as a good bulwark against Germany, which they continue to fear. Then in 1922, Germany signs the Rapallo Treaty with the Russians, which basically allows them to test out tanks and other cool equipment in Russia, and do some maneuvers, which allows them to circumvent the military limitations placed on them by the Versailles Treaty. And the Russians gain access to a lot of good tech, so it's a win-win situation. In 1923, we have the Ruhr Crisis and the advent of hyperinflation. So basically, the French are not happy with the Germans because they're not paying them enough reparations, so they occupy part of the Ruhr by bringing in French troops. Part of the Ruhr was already occupied by Entente forces, like a few cities were, but here we have a full-on invasion into the Rhineland. So the German government basically the local people respond by not working at all, because they're not going to be working just so the French can take it, and the German government promised to support their strike by paying equal wages, as if they were still working, to anybody who's not working in zones under French occupation. And this whole situation basically leads to hyperinflation. Although by 1924, despite of course all the horrible stories you heard, this is resolved very effectively, and the Dawes Plan, which comes along after it, even weakens the burden of hyperinflation. Germany introduces the new Reichsmark, which doesn't have any inflation problems, and its value is vetted in Germany itself. So German land, German buildings. That's the basis for its value. The French are forced to withdraw because they achieved nothing. They're just wasting money by keeping troops in Germany, and the rest of the world is now seeing them as aggressors. Also a negative for France. All these negative views of France are building. And in 1925, we have the Locarno Agreement, and that is the pinnacle, the most important thing for Weimar diplomacy, because in the aftermath of the Ruhr Crisis, Britain and Italy basically agreed to intervene to protect either Germany or France if the other side violates the border. So if France crosses the German border, Britain and Italy will support Germany, and if Germany invades France, then Italy and Britain will support France. That's the deal. But it's important to remember that the Locarno Treaty only covers the western border. So if Germany, invades Poland or Czechoslovakia, and then France responds, as a supporter of the Little Entente, then the British and the Italians would actually be required to support Germany, because the treaty does not care about the East at all, which really undermines the Little Entente and France's ability and credibility in its commitment to the East and its whole strategy of having that bulwark against Germany on the other side. Because, this creates a situation where France signed a treaty where it, basically renounces its ability to support them, but it's, still expecting those countries to support France, the other way around. And some other things to consider is that, we have the Berlin Treaty in 1926, which is just like an upgrade to Rapallo. In 1926, Germany also finally joins the League of Nations. And in 1929, we've got the Young Plan, which is a response following the Great Depression to support Germany financially, and it basically leads to effectively eliminating reparations. And we should remember that while reparations, they were pretty significant in propaganda and in the view of the German public, in reality they weren't that high. They never were, and definitely after the Dawes Plan and then the Young Plan, they basically became non-existent. Now, we have one super important person here, and that is Gustav Stresemann. Gustav Stresemann is Germany's foreign minister. You can see his photo. He's bald. That's his defining feature. And a question we have as IB historians is whether he was an internationalist or a nationalist. What were his objectives? Was his diplomacy with, masterstroke at Locarno and so on, his ascension to the League of Nations, were these all attempts to restore Germany's power? Or was Stresemann really trying to make Germany into a country which could function as a member of the international, moral-based League of Nations system? And there's a lot of disagreement here, because some people believe that, it was actually... and there's disagreement among historians, and there are also conflicting sources, because he told one thing to German elites, he wrote another thing to international diplomats, the public speeches he made to the German people, his official announcements to the rest of the world, even his writing to his friends or to different elites. And so it's very hard to tell. But one interesting view is presented by Henry Kissinger, the United States Secretary of State in the 1970s, who basically argued in his book Diplomacy that Gustav Stresemann could have started out as a nationalist, but working as part of the international community and as part of this world order, he could have grown to believe it over time. So, there's also the possibility that this changed over time. But anyway, this is a question that it's important to consider, because in any IB discussion of the Weimar Republic and its diplomacy, Gustav Stresemann is the central figure, and understanding his character can add a lot to your discussions of Weimar foreign policy and international relations in interwar Europe in general. So, now, one more thing, let's go back to the economic crises, because we had two economic crises in Germany. First of all, hyperinflation following the Ruhr crisis and during the Ruhr crisis, and second of all, the Young Plan, and second of all, the Great Depression, which was followed by the Young Plan. And these are very different. First of all, there was hyperinflation following the Ruhr crisis, but the Great Depression did not result in any hyperinflation. As a matter of fact, there was deflation. And the Ruhr crisis was not really all that bad, because, it was really bad for people like pensioners. Like, for example, if you had like a pension of, let's say, a few $100,000 even, that basically meant nothing by the end of the crisis. You were pretty much screwed. But it didn't really lead to people being fired, to the economy collapsing, to massive layoffs. People were still treated in kind and stuff. The Great Depression did. And while the Ruhr crisis was effectively handled with the new Reichsmark, there was a lot of optimism, hey, the government handled this pretty well, and there was support for the government's actions in the Ruhr, supporting the local people against French aggression. The Great Depression, well, it was different, because suddenly, just in the span of like 5 years, in one decade, you have another giant crisis, and the Great Depression was very damaging to Weimar democracy, unlike the hyperinflation crisis. And after it, we can see that fringe parties like the Nazis and the KPD, or the communists, gained a lot of ground. And now we can take a look at the Great Depression, just as a side note, because of course this is integral to a lot of problems in interwar Europe. So basically, before the Great Depression, we had this cycle. The Germans had to pay back reparations to the French and the British. The French and the British had to repay loans to the United States because they borrowed a lot of money to fund their war efforts during World War I. And American bankers were now lending money to Germany, and Germany was using that money to pay reparations. So we have this, cycle where, all it takes is one link, and you can see what chaos will ensue, how significant economic damage may be. So, what caused the Great Depression in the United States? First of all, people were very optimistic about the stock market. So much so that, people, not even rich people, just regular people, would take out massive loans that they were not able to repay, and then they would put it all in the stock market, and then use their earnings from that to repay the loan, or to play again, because it was assumed that all that money is going to go up. But suddenly the stock market crashed, and all those people were now significantly in debt. Then we had real wage stagnation. American production was growing, business was booming, but real wages for the workers, so how much stuff they can actually buy with the money they're making, was rising much, much slowly, almost stagnating. And this disconnect was recipe for disaster. Then we had oversupply. The agricultural market basically tanked because it was too efficient and too much food was being produced, which led to farmers not having good income. As a matter of fact, the farmers in the United States were a few decades behind their city-dwelling or small-town folks in terms of development. And we also had the issue of industrial oversupply, where also just industry in general was producing much more stuff than they were able to. Then we had a slowdown in housing demand, which also affected the economy negatively. We had the whole cycle of reparations and loans, which I discussed. I mean, you guys can clearly see why it's unhealthy. It's just shuffling money, and one damage in one state can lead to damage in all states. And then we also had the rise of tariffs, which were bad for international trade and helped. And later, especially since a lot of countries levied tariffs in response to the Great Depression, they made it much harder for the world as a whole to recover. So all of that collectively helped to bring about the Great Depression and make it as severe as it was. So now, before we move on to Adolf Hitler and his diplomacy, does anybody have any questions about the Weimar Republic and its international relations?